Hi everyone, Patrick here again from Eramosa Engineering. In this tutorial, I'm going to look at a slightly more complex calculation to give you a sense of all the variety of things that the calculation engine is capable of. Ultimately, we'll still be just scratching the surface, but it'll give you a sense of what you can do with the calculation engine. So I've already set up a calculation. Hopefully you've already watched the previous video tutorial on performing a simple calculation where we just took a value and multiplied it by 10. This is going to be a bit of a variation on that theme. So you can see here I'm in the General Settings and Versions tab. I've already got this set up. I'm calling it 10% calculation, and what this calculation is going to do is it's going to take a block of values, one for each hour at the top of every hour of each day, and is going to look at what is the average of all of those values. And then it's going to look at the first value in the day at midnight, and it's going to ask whether that value is higher or lower than the average for that day. And if it's lower, the calculation is going to add 10% to that value. And if it's higher than the average, it's going to subtract 10% from that value. So again, there may not be a direct real-world application for this exact calculation, but my hope is that it will demonstrate to you some of the things that we can do in this calculation engine, and it might inspire some ideas of your own. So I've got this schedule set up, so it's going to run at midnight every day. I've got all my effective dates for my version and my last run date all set up to how I want it. I'll just go through my variables quickly. So I've got an input variable that I've called input variable again, and I'm going to be pulling data from this tag here, and I'm going to be doing it using interpolated sampling mode. And the sampling interval is 1 hour, so that's what's going to take the value at the beginning of each hour and bring that as an input. And my start offset is 1 day and my duration is 1 day. So that tells us that every time the calculation engine starts up, it's going to look back at the day previous and it's going to collect a data value at the top of each hour. And then I've created an output variable here called output variable again, and I've created a tag that I've just called plus or minus 10%. And my save offset is 1 day. So that means it's going to output the result of this calculation and it's going to timestamp it at the beginning of the previous day. So let's take a look at the edit/test pane. I've already got the code set up here, so I'm just going to be copying and pasting and explaining as I go along. I'm going to take this line first. And one thing I should mention off the top, this can cause confusion, is the way that the calculation engine works is it can take in a large number of input values and it can create arrays out of those. But in terms of output values, the calculation engine can only provide one output value per tag, per iteration, or per run. So that's important to know. So in this first line of code, I've set up an if statement. So it's helpful if you have a bit of a background knowledge in some basic programming, but an if statement will basically perform a logical test, and if the statement or the condition evaluates to true, then it will perform the next block of code that follows the conditional statement. So what this if statement is doing is it's checking the input value and making sure that it's not a null value, because we want to eliminate data that's not good, that's not going to serve our purpose. And if it's an empty value, then that probably suggests that there's something wrong with the data and so we want to exclude it. So that's what that line code does. We call it a null checker. So I'm going to go to the next line. I'm going to copy this portion here. So there's another if statement that's going to exist inside of our previous if statement. And this if statement is checking whether the value of the input variable, which is going to be our data value at midnight from the previous day, it's going to compare it to the average of all those values at the top of each hour in the previous day. That might sound a little confusing, but hopefully you can follow along. So this means if this input variable value is greater than the average, then this next block of code will be performed. And this here is that next block of code. So this is saying if this statement is true, then we'll perform this, which is going to take the input variable value and it's going to multiply it by 90% or 0.9. So effectively subtracting 10% from the original value. And then it's going to store that in our output variable. So now we're going to do the converse of that, and we're going to create an else statement. So this is what the code will look at, what the program will look at if that first if statement here is not true, then it will perform this block of code, which is to multiply the input variable value by 1.1 or 110%, so effectively adding 10% to this input variable and outputting that. So that's the skeleton of our code. Now there's just a couple of other things I want to show, and the big one is commenting. So comments are lines that you can insert into your code, and they're preceded by 2 forward slashes, and that tells the calculation engine to ignore that line when it's compiling the code. And it's a way to create just plain language descriptions of what's happening within your code so that other users can better understand what you're doing, or you can remember what you did later on. So this one is just saying that this first line is checking for null values. And then I'm going to put in another comment here saying subtract 10% if the value is greater than the average. And I'll put in a similar one that says add 10% if the value is less than the average. And now the last thing that I want to put in this code, it's called the @show command, and it doesn't affect the final result. It's just a way for when we run the test on the code to make sure if there's any errors or warnings, it will actually give us it'll output on our screen whatever we ask it to. So in this case, I want to actually see what the average of all the input variables are to just double check for my own peace of mind to make sure that my program's running as I intend it to. So now we go over to our test pane here. It's the moment of truth again. We click run test. It's going to think for a little bit. And so here it's showing that I have an error. So this is where you need a little bit of detective work, and I'm guessing that I'm probably missing a couple of semicolons and probably a curly brace. So that shows you how the error function works. If it comes up in red, that means that your code can't execute properly. But if it comes up with just a warning, then it's something less critical, and you can still run your calculation. So there we go. So I put in those extra curly braces and some semicolons, and everything's working nicely now. So we'll just take a second to look at this. In this pane below here, it shows all the input values that are coming into the calculation. So these are the raw data values at the top of each hour. For the day previous, you see I put in September 2nd here. So because my start offset for my input variable was 1 day, it goes to the beginning of the previous day, September 1st, and is bringing back all these values. And in here is where I see the results of my @show command. So this is actually showing me the average of all these input variables. So now we can see, because my program, my code here, is designed so that it compares this first value, this midnight value, to my average. I can see that 628 is less than 652, so I would expect it to be adding 10%. And just looking at it quickly, it looks like that's approximately right. I can double check it on my calculator. Let's do 628.8243 multiplied by 1.1, and we get 691.7067, which is exactly what I have there. So everything seems to be working well there. I'm just going to hit save. Now I'll go back to the general settings and versions. Everything's set up there. I'm going to enable the version, enable the calculation as a whole, and then my calculation engine itself is already enabled, so I'm just going to hit run now, and then we'll just let this run and perform the calculation. We'll pause the video and we'll be back in just a minute. Okay, so we're back. The calculation engine was performed. I expanded the effective dates a little bit just to show more data. So I've created a data query. I just chose the output tag, which shows here the tag that we created called plus or minus 10%. And then this is the original tag from which the data is being drawn. So I chose an interpolated sampling mode for that, set at 1 day. So that's bringing us back the value at midnight for each of these days here. So if you compare these two values and you do the math, you'll see that this value here is 10% more than this value. This value here is 10% less than this value, and so on. So our calculation worked, and I hope you found this video tutorial helpful. We'll see you in the next one.